My name is Carla Evans, and I am a professor at the psychology department here at York University. It is my great pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce Professor Guido Alfani, our speaker today. Guido Alfani is a professor of economic history at the Bocconi University at Milan, Italy. He's the author of The Calamities and the Economy in the Renaissance Italy, The Grand Tour of the Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and the co-author of The Lion's Share, Inequality and the Rise of the First Fiscal State in Pre-Industrial Europe. Today, he will be sharing with us his findings from his latest book, As Gods Among Men. He will offer a history of the rich and super rich in the West, examining who they were, how they accumulated their wealth, and what role they play in society. So, without much further ado, Guido, over to you.
Thank you very much, Carla, and thanks to all those who are taking part in this presentation. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk to you about the book. For some technical problems, I have to rely on the help of Michael to change the slide. So Michael, please, I would go straight to the second slide. Thank you. So this book is structured in three parts. The first is about trying to quantify how many were rich and how rich were the rich across the ages. And then there is an issue with defining what wealth is and how you can define the rich. And I will only tell you very few things about this part for reasons of time. I will tell you more about the second central part, which is concerned with the different paths to affluence across history. And then I will look into the third and final part, which tries to explore the role played by the rich in society and also some of the concerns that society had in the Western tradition with the fact that some individual members of society itself became much richer than all the others. Now, Michael, please change the slide. How can we define the rich? Well, one simple thing is to only look at the top of the distribution of wealth. So in this case, you have the wealth share of the rich as 5%. I will not bother you with many graphs in this presentation. I only have a few right at the beginning. And if we look at this kind of metric based on the information we have, which mostly comes from projects which I coordinated in the past, you see that in the pre-industrial period, from when we have information from the beginning of the 14th century to circa 1800, there is a long-run tendency for wealth to become ever more concentrated at the top. This is basically the story from the 1450s or 1500s on. And there is only a phase of inequality reduction which is triggered by the Black Death pandemic in the middle of the 14th century. Except for that, we find pretty much everywhere wealth becoming ever more concentrated. There is one exception, which we know about, and that's the exception of Germany. Germany is very similar to the other areas we can study, except for the 17th century, when it is affected by a terrible plague in the 1620s, which is the worst plague affecting South Europe from the Black Death, plus the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, which was the most destructive conflict of pre-industrial Europe. So it's the combination of plague and war which in Germany create a second phase of inequality reduction. Otherwise, the rich continue to grow richer in the early modern period. The rich also become more numerous, and this can be studied in different ways. I also look at the percentage of people who had wealth above 10 times the median. And the advantage of that metric is that it's not fixed, right? If we only look at the top 5%, it's always going to be the top 5% of society. So I will not show you that, but the point is I define the rich in different ways, and I try and look at a combination of metrics. If we move in the following period, thank you, Michael, from 1800 till pretty much today, you see that the tendency for wealth inequality to grow, in this case, you have the wealth share of the 1%ers, continues to be a constant tendency, except for another phase of inequality reduction, the so-called grid compression from, say, 1914 to the middle of 1970s. Now, Michael, could you please go to the next slide? Thank you. So usually we say that this phase was triggered by the world wars, which is true generally speaking, but the point is we shouldn't forget that this phase of inequality reduction also continues after the end of World War II for a couple of decades, and that's usually associated to the development of the welfare state in Europe. And indeed, the welfare state was paid for by very progressive and relatively intense taxation of pretty much everything, so income, inheritances, and patrimony, so wealth. And that kind of very progressive taxation begins in the World Wars period. So the point is, it's not only catastrophe which leads to this great compression of wealth inequality, it's also something which has much more to do with human agency. So actual decisions about how we want our society to be organized. If we bring everything together, next slide, you have this, this picture. Again, the 1%ers in the last 7 centuries or so, and you see that these general phases of inequality reduction really look like exceptions. But again, they are exceptions, but we know from the experience of the 20th century that for human societies, inequality is not destiny. So in some sense, it's a matter of choice. Now, this kind of information comes from recent studies on long-term trends in economic inequality. And we now know much more about that than we used to do. I mean, in the last 10 or 15 years, really the base of knowledge on these has expanded very considerably. But there haven't been any previous attempts at studying who belonged to these top wealth shares. So who were the rich and how did they become wealthy? Next slide, please. And in the book, I try and disentangle what I think historically are the three main paths to affluence: the path of the nobility and of aristocracy, that of entrepreneurship, and the path of finance. There are other ways of becoming rich, for example, practicing a legal profession, so being a successful lawyer or doctor, which I cover in the book, but less systematically, because if you look at the number of people who became rich in that way, that's less important than these other paths. Now, the path of nobility, with which I will begin, here you have 3 examples that I make in the book, is historically very important because, of course, in the Middle Ages, it is probably the main path if you wanted to acquire great wealth, or of course, in many cases, it was simply inherited wealth. And also because looking at these brings to the fore of the discussion some general problems we have with, for example, the establishment of wealth dynasties. And I will try and tell you more about that later. Now, these 3 people, well, 2 of them are connected to British history, sort of, but they are examples of, different kinds of wealthy nobles. The first guy, the one to the left, Alan the Red, followed William the Conqueror in the conquest of England, and he probably fought at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. And then, differently from many other Normans who had joined William, he remained in England and he developed a specialty, which was that of quenching rebellions. And every time he was given parts of the lands of those which had rebelled. And in this way, according to some metrics, which are, of course, a little bit, uncertain, but if you look at the share of the English product that he might have controlled, he might have been the richest person to ever live in Britain. And he started out as being a very minor noble, right? He was the 3rd son of a count, and he grew to this exceptional level of wealth thanks to some sort of virtues, which were in particular military virtues. So he is the one who is in family made the wealth of the noble dynasty. The second guy, the one in the middle, Antoine II Crozat, instead, is exemplary of those families which in the early modern period try to become noble. He is the first person in his family who actually becomes a noble. His father had started this process, but he never went beyond simply marrying a noble woman, right? And the reason why the Crozat family wanted to ennoble themselves is that they understood that in this way they could have had access to some better opportunity of profiting by working in connection with the growing French state administration. And in fact, Antoine II Crozat becomes the main tax farmer of the King of France, Louis XIV. And later he's given the monopoly of the Louisiana trade, he's given the monopoly of the slave trade with the Spanish colonies. And he becomes possibly the richest person in France in the early 18th century. And Voltaire called him Crozat Crésus because of his exceptional wealth, from Croesus, the ancient and supposedly super rich king of Lydia. And the point is, in this phase, we see people who want to become noble, and the reason why they want to become noble, and this continues still well into the 19th century, actually until the very end of the 19th century, is that in that way they can get access to additional opportunities. And then the last person I mentioned, Hugh Grosvenor, the current 7th Duke of Westminster, he was the 10th richest Briton in 2020, and he is basically the example of somebody who is a noble and who has inherited his wealth. The Grosvenor family, by English standards, is recent nobility because they only became nobles in the 17th century, but they became super wealthy because they inherited and they acquired lands in the area around nowadays London, which in recent decades has become some of the most valuable real estate in the world, right? So Michael, could you please go to the thank you. So the fact is, Hugh Grosvenor is, in a sense, exemplary of an issue we have with this kind of path to wealth, which is that of having inherited one's privileged position and one's wealth. So the point is, if you look historically at these noble dynasties, there is a distinction between the first generations, those who made the fortunes of the families, and those who actually simply inherited their status, which is not to say that the nobles didn't have to do anything to simply keep their position. They, at the very least, needed to avoid vanquishing, dispersing the family wealth, right? But there is a difference. And to us, meaning to us people living in the West in the early 21st century, inherited wealth seems sort of less legitimate compared to wealth which one has made. So there is a kind of cultural distinction that we tend to make. And of course, this is our distinction. It's not something which has to do with how people in the Middle Ages or at the beginning of the early modern period considered their situation. This is our cultural bias, if you want. And the other problem we have today, the other concern we have, which can be better understood if we look at the nobility, has to do with the concerns regarding the development of what is often called a global aristocracy. Now, the concept of aristocracy is different from that of nobility. You don't have the need for transmitting in an hereditary way noble titles to have an aristocracy. You only need to have some sort of privilege, right? So you can have an aristocracy in places like the United States in the 19th century, where there is no formal nobility. And the point is, there are scholars who argue that today we are observing the development of a global aristocracy. So an aristocracy defined at the global level, people who have some shared interests, some shared experiences, some shared tastes, went to the same schools, know each other in some sense. And the problem there is that as an aristocracy is defined by privilege, it is also exclusive. It's defined by exclusion, because you can't have a privilege spread too widely, otherwise it becomes no privilege at all. And that's the problem we have. So if this is true, and I'm not telling you it is, but this is a concept that many have today, then we might have in the future a problem regarding mobility from the bottom to the very top of the social economic pyramid, if you want. And then we'll go back later to the issue of the wealth dynasties in particular. Michael, can you please change slide? Thank you. If we move to the second of the main paths of affluence to affluence, which I distinguish, that of entrepreneurship and innovation, This is the one which we today tend to perceive as the most legitimate, but as we will see, this wasn't the case in the Middle Ages, right? Here you have people from different era. You have, to the bottom right, of course, Bill Gates, who is an example of somebody who becomes super rich by exploiting the opportunities of the computer and information age. You have Richard Arkwright, the inventor of the famous water frame, one of the main innovations of the first industrial revolution in Britain. Then to the left, we have Francesco Di Marco d'Attini. I will tell you something more about him later, but this guy became one of the most important European merchants of the 14th century, and he actually was made an orphan by the Black Death in 1348, and he survived, differently from his brothers and sisters and from his parents, and he was able to exploit the relatively socially mobile situation created by that pandemic to become very wealthy himself, starting with relatively humble conditions. So he moves from Tuscany to Lyon in France, to Avignon in France. He starts trading between France and Italy. He's very successful, and at some point he comes back to Tuscany and he opens branches around Europe. And we know everything about this guy because his personal archive was found virtually complete in a hidden section of his palace in Prato at the end of the 19th century. Anyway, the final case is that of Jan Pieter Zoon Koen, who can be taken as an example of somebody who became very wealthy exploiting the new opportunities offered by the opening of the Atlantic trade in the early modern period. Is also exemplary of the dark side, if you want, not only of the Atlantic trade, but also of entrepreneurship, because it can also be, being entrepreneurial, it can also mean being entrepreneurial in terms of exploitation. And this guy in particular is also, he became the Governor General of the Dutch East India Company in the early 17th century. And he is also well known for his particularly harsh treatment of the natives in the Asian areas where the Dutch East India Company had its interest. And I mean, to a level that even for the very low standards of Europeans of the time were considered to be somehow troubling. A well-known example is that of the Banda Islands in the Indian Ocean. The Banda Islands were the place of provisioning of the nutmeg in the 17th century, which was one of the most valuable spices that you could try and import to Europe. And the point is, the Dutch had an agreement with the natives, native people of the Banda Islands, which for the Dutch meant a monopoly, but the natives understood it differently. So they also wanted to trade with the English. And to solve the problem, Jan Pieter Zoon Koen, as the Governor General of the Dutch East India Company, decided to invade the Banda Islands, to exterminate most of the population, to bring away the others, deportating them to Jakarta, and then to repopulate the Banda Islands with slaves acquired in Asia and in Africa, because they were considered to be more docile than the natives. And this was too much, even again for the low standards of the Europeans of the time. And this is only to remember there is also kind of a dark side to entrepreneurship and innovation. It depends on where you apply entrepreneurship and innovation. Next slide, please. And I also, of course, look at many other issues with this specific path to affluence or problems that we want to discuss historically. One is the problem of trying to disentangle in history phases during which it was relatively easy to become rich in this way. And I mentioned some, the immediate post-Black Death period, so in the 14th century, the phase of the opening of Atlantic trade routes, the phase of the Industrial Revolution, at least the early phases of the computer and information age. And there is a lot more work which could be done in this area, but some phases can already be clearly identified. And then there is something which actually connects directly to the discussion of nobility as a path to affluence, which is the observation that, again, you have the first generations, those who made the wealth of their family, and then you have the second, third, and fourth generations, those who actually inherit the accumulated wealth of the family and who might have different attitudes, different interests, different behaviors compared to their ancestors. And the point is, we observe repeatedly in history, including in the phase of the first and second industrial revolution, we observe how wealthy families establish dynasties, and these dynasties become increasingly aristocratic. So they build a kind of wealth aristocracy, which in some settings is very clear. Take, for example, the United States at the end of the Gilded Age, right? When you have, contrast between old wealth and new wealth families, all of them commoners basically, and where the issue of defining who belonged to the real wealth aristocracy of, say, New York was a very important social issue. But from the historical point of view, from my perspective, the more important thing is the following. Remember, an aristocracy is defined by exclusion, right? So the point is, if you have the development of a wealth aristocracy, to simply survive, this aristocracy will have to try to exclude and to keep the others down where they belong, right? So the historical question becomes whether the end of these phases of relatively easy enrichment through entrepreneurship and innovation is also connected to this process of development of wealth aristocracies. And I mean, we see this happening time and again. So at the very least, this is an hypothesis that we would want to make, because we are used to think that today we live in a phase during which it is relatively easy to exploit opportunities to begin rich, right? But at the same time, we have concerns about the development of a global aristocracy. So we might actually, of course, under the worst case scenario, be experiencing the end of this phase, right? And it might be the two things together will make it more complicated, growing to high wealth in the future, and might actually contribute to kind of preventing us from exploiting all the opportunities coming from this new phase of technological innovation. Next slide. And finally, we have finance. Of course, if you look at the Middle Ages or the early modern period, distinguishing who's a merchant and who's a financier, it's not always very clear. But it's important to distinguish finance from the rest, because finance is the path to affluence, or the way in which you can make money, which has been more troubling, again, in the Western tradition, but in this case, really from the classical period until today, with the Middle Ages strengthening even more this bias against wealth made in finance. So let's take Francesco Di Marco d'Attini, the super rich merchant which I mentioned before, the guy who became rich thanks to the opportunities opening in the post-Black Death scenario. When he was already pretty old, in 1398, Francesco Di Marco d'Attini decides that he also wants to open a bank. And then he writes to his business associates, asking them, what do you think about this idea? And he gets all these letters. We have an example here in which these people tell him, don't do that. Why would you ever want to do that? I mean, you are already one of the richest people in Florence, meaning one of the richest people in Europe. And you have an excellent reputation. And if you become a financier, if you open your bank, if you become a money changer, as they said back then, I mean, everybody will start thinking that you have become a usurer, because all money changers are usurers. So there is no way you can do this without raising some eyebrows. Now, in that period, it was entirely legal to practice finance, or certain activities were entirely legal already, right? In a previous period, it was kind of more doubtful. But in that moment, it was entirely legal and formally acceptable. But the bias against finance has survived. And of course, this weakens across time, but it survives sort of till today. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So I could make you more examples. Some of these examples we'll mention later, but let me just tell you something about Grazia Nasi, because I would really like to tell you about at least one woman when making these examples. And the problem we have, of course, with the rich people in the past is that very often women are simply hidden by our sources, right? Because we have maybe only the general accounts, but we don't have, say, the correspondence, the letters. We know, for example, that Margherita, the wife of Francesco Di Marco Dattini, was helping him managing his firm. He was basically managing the Italian activities of the husband when he was abroad, right? So we know this because exceptionally we have all the personal correspondence, all the personal letters of this family. But otherwise, we wouldn't simply know. But in the case of finance, I mean, and another reason, by the way, for which we will not usually know about women is that there were also legal limitations to the ability of women to act in the economy. And from this point of view, finance stands out in a positive way because it was a relatively open sector of the economy for women to act. And we find across the early modern period many examples of cities and areas in which women were an important component of those providing money for loans. Many among them were widows. So they did that also because for them, it was a way of using the resources of the family, which was open to them, right? Of course, there were problems. Again, Gracia Nasi is a very good example. She was a Portuguese woman born in 1510, and she belonged to a family of Marranos, so Jews converted to the Christian religion, right? She was made to marry her uncle, Francisco Mendes, and the Mendes family had played a very important role in opening the Atlantic route, provisioning pepper from Asia by circumnavigating Africa. And by the beginning of the 16th century, they were controlling an important share of the imports of pepper from Asia to Europe. And they were extremely rich, and they were also very active in finance. Beyond this, they were also financiers. So Gracia Nasi becomes a widow in 1338 at the death of Francisco Mendes. And then the problem she has is that of being a lone woman, only with a daughter, in a world which was, of course, dominated by males, and she really doesn't want to be forced to marry somebody she doesn't like to marry. And on top of that, in 1536, the Portuguese Inquisition had been established. So she also feared some sort of religious persecution, which is why she flees to Antwerp in the Low Countries, joining the brother of his deceased husband, Diogo Mendes, and he starts managing the Mendes family, the Mendes firm, together with him. And we know this also because when Diogo dies, in his will, he establishes that Gracia Nasi has to become the manager of the entire fortune of the Mendes family. But then she has again the same problem. She's a super rich woman, and she risks being kind of expropriated. And in this case, the problem is the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who tries to make her marry a minor noble from the house of Aragon, who had promised, well, not her, but in fact her daughter marry this guy, who had offered 200,000 ducats to the emperor in case this matchmaking proves successful. And she really wants to oppose this, and in order to do it, she escapes with some subterfuge from Antwerp. She escapes first to Lyon, then to Venice, and she ends up in the end in Ferrara in Italy, where at the time there was the largest Jewish community of Europe. And that was an exceptionally open and free place for the standards of the time. But then the issue is that in Ferrara, she resumes practicing the Jewish religion openly. And that was a problem because she had theoretically converted to a Christian religion. So she was charged with apostasy, which is why she had to flee again. And she ends up in Constantinople at the court of the Sultan, which from the point of view of religious tolerance was better than Christian Europe back then. And from there, she continues to use the wealth of her family to escape, to help Jewish people escaping persecution across Europe. Again, this is an exceptional case, but it's also a pretty interesting case which suggests how finance also has some more positive sides than what most people back then used to think. Regarding this, Michael, please change the slides. Oh, sorry, I was forgetting about this slide. Now, I also try in the book to measure the prevalence of different paths to affluence across history. Here you have, please change the slide, Michael. Here you have those who in Britain bequest a fortune of at least £100,000 in different periods. And what you see here is the progressive decline from the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century. And again, consider these are people at the moment of death. So the observation kind of reflect the reality of where wealth was made in the previous years, right? So you see the decline of wealth made in real estate. And this is also the decline of the nobility as a component of the richest among Britain. And when I say the richest, consider that this might have been the top, not the top 1%, but the top 0.001% of the British population. So it's a much smaller percentage. So you see the decline of that, and at the same time, you see the increase in those whose fortunes was made in the industry and commerce. Of course, exploiting opportunities of the Industrial Revolution and of the ability of Britain to control international trade in the 20th century. Now, look at the figures for the early 20th century. Michael, change the slides. They don't change much by the 21st century. Here you have some figures coming from the rich list of the Sunday Times, so the richest 1,000 people in the United Kingdom, and you see that real estate remains a pretty high percentage as an area as a source of wealth compared to other countries. It's like zero among the richest people of Germany today. And this is also connected to the persistence of the nobility as a component of the very wealthy in Britain. So Hugh Grosvenor is not nearly the same example of a noble person who belongs to the richest 1,000 people in Britain. There are many other examples. And Britain, of course, compared to Germany, to this day also shows a much higher prevalence of fortunes made in finance. Next slide, please. If we look at another kind of information, these are the billionaires listed by Forbes, basically. You see that finance today is a pretty important source of extreme wealth, much higher, in fact, at any previous time in Europe, in history, sorry. And this is maybe a top 0.0001%, but we have evidence that this is also the case when you move down the wealth pyramid. Inherited wealth across the board is pretty important. So 1/3 of the billionaires today have inherited their wealth, and women are a growing minority, but still a minority. And in fact, they're not even half those who have inherited their wealth. I will move on for reasons of time, but there is much about this in the book. Now, let me tell you something about the role played by the rich in society. Now, there is, first of all, a concern about the ability of super rich individuals to control the politics of a democratic society. Here, I could read these two texts, but next slide, please. I don't have the time. And the point is, these two texts basically tell us the same thing. If you have a democracy, a city governed democratically, or a modern democracy, so they are not talking about the same kind of democracy, but they are looking at democracies, then the fact that you have super rich individuals might prevent the system to work in the way in which it is supposed to. And who are these people? Next slide. Well, one is Nicolas Oresme, who is translating and commenting upon Aristotle's Politics in the 14th century, and the second, Thomas Piketty, in the 21st century. So, we have these two scholars, 7 centuries removed, who basically point at the same problem. And already Aristotle, in the Athenian democracy was pointing exactly the same problem. Now, the political side of the story has always been a concern. The political role, in particular super rich, has always been a concern. But in the Middle Ages, worries about the rich were much more general. And you see here that an example is Thomas Aquinas, the greatest theologian of medieval Europe. And the point is, Aquinas was making it very clear that if you're a commoner, not a noble, because if you're a noble, there is a reason why you're wealthy. It's ordered by God if you want, and you have some responsibility towards your subjects. So it corresponds to how society should be organized. But if you're a commoner and if you're wealthy, the only possibility is that you are a sinner and your sin is avarice or greed. Because why did you accumulate your wealth for if you could have used it to help the poor? Big problem. And this is such a big problem for Thomas Aquinas that he even recommended to the rulers of cities and states to try and prevent their subjects from becoming involved in long-range trade, because in that way they would have become too wealthy and then sinners, and this would have been polluting for society. Now, the problem here is that Aquinas, as many other theologians of the late Middle Ages, was actually reacting to something which he was observing from the commercial revolution of the Middle Ages, which began in the 11th and 12th century on. We have these commoners' families who become very wealthy, much wealthier than anything which existed before, by exploiting the new opportunities connected to long-range trade, right? And then to finance, which developed also to service that trade. So it was reacting to something which was happening. And the theologians weren't able to stop this. Next slide, please. They were able to enroute a bias against finance, because, of course, if you were a financier, you were, even a worse case, because, again, you were basically a usurer for Aquinas, because you can't make money out of money. But in a later period, already by the 15th century, we find that scholars start finding a social role for the rich to play. And the problem is, the problem wasn't going away. The rich were there. They weren't going to disappear. And in some way, reflection and society adapted to their presence. And what was this role? Well, this was very clearly put by Poggio Bracciolini, a Tuscan humanist at the beginning of the 15th century. And he says, the rich in society are like bars of money, private bars of money, in which the society, community can tap in times of crisis. Exactly like we do when we have public granaries with food reserves or wheat and others, when we are faced with a famine, right? So if we have a crisis, whom are we going to ask for help? Next slide. Not the poor, because the poor will not have anything to give us. We'll ask the rich for help because they can help us. And in which way you ask them? Well, you ask them kindly, can you please loan us some money to buy grain abroad? If they aren't willing to, you force them to provide loans, or you can simply tax them or even expropriate them. So the point is, the reserves are there. If they are physically present in the city, they can help us. We can make them help us. Now, I would really have liked to show you a picture of, representing this, but I couldn't find any, so I cheated. And by cheating, I mean that I asked the artificial intelligence. Next slide, please. Please, dear artificial intelligence, show me the rich as bunch of money. And this is what I got. Then I told the artificial intelligence, well, please give me something more realistic. Next slide. And this is what I got. And at this time, I was kind of mildly scared and I stopped. Right? So this, anyway, I don't know what to do with this. Next slide, please. Going back to something of more substance, if you want. Beyond acting as private reserves of money, there is another function assigned to the rich, which is that of magnificence. Here you have something said by another Italian humanist from the late 15th century, Giovanni Pontano. He mentions Cosimo de' Medici. He says, this guy is the first in our age who re-established the ancient magnificence of the classical period. And what is magnificence? Well, you know, basically simply by building a palace, a super rich family can make the city splendid in the interest of everybody, because even if you aren't allowed into the palace, you can still profit from that aesthetically by moving through. And, you know, this is not such a strange concept. If we sail the Canal Grande in today Venice, we don't get into the palaces, but all these palaces along the Canal Grande, which the rich of the time built to show off one towards the other, are something which makes the place enjoyable for us. And of course, this is even more the case if you, instead of simply building your palace, establish a monastery or establish a public library, like Cosimo de' Medici did. Next slide, please. So was Cosimo magnificent? Sure he was. He established the Medici Library in Florence, probably the first public library of Renaissance Europe. He established many other institutions. He established the monastery, or he endowed the monastery of San Marco. He built residences and villas, which today are very important museums. Next slide. But the point is, was this generosity? Now, in fact, Cosimo de' Medici is a good example because he performs both the functions assigned to the rich at the end of the Middle Ages. He saves his city from financial collapse in 1434. He had been exiled in 1433, charged with intending to rise above the other citizens, so intending to upturn the Republic. Then Florence goes on losing a war against Siena over the control of the city of Lucca. And then Florence can't repay its war debt with the spoils of war because they lost. And what they do? Well, of course, they exile the enemies of the Medici family, and they call Cosimo back, and they ask him kindly if he could please save everybody from bankruptcy, which he does. He does that. And on top of that, exactly from that moment, he intensifies his magnificence. And the point is, the bargain was very clear. Magnificence is not munificence. The moment when Cosimo de' Medici intensifies his magnificence, so 1434, is also considered the beginning of the so-called hidden seigniory of the Medici family in Florence. His descendants will become formally the Grand Dukes of Tuscany, first of Florence and then of Tuscany, okay? So in a sense, he saved his city, but he bought the state, right? And magnificence means to do great deeds. Munificence means making gifts. When Cosimo de' Medici did these great deeds for his city, he was also making it as a claim to have a right to rule the city itself. Now, next slide. In the early modern period, this continues. We find, I mean, the Reformation only strengthens the view that becoming wealthy is some sort of legitimate. The rich continue to perform this role big time, and we can see this in the prevalence of the so-called forced loans that everybody was asking to the subjects, especially in times of war, both the monarchies and the patrician republic of the time, like Venice. Next slide. And in fact, next slide, please. Thank you. And in fact, if I were to mention the last time that I could argue a super rich individual saved this country from financial collapse, I would argue that this might have been the case of the United States in 1907 during a bank crisis. And this is when JP Morgan, faced with the risk of having, after the weekend, a run on banks, brings to his private library in New York, which, by the way, today is a museum, gifted to the city by the Morgan family, magnificence. He brings to his private library a group of financiers from New York. He locks everybody in and tells them, you are not getting out of the room until we have found a solution. And they found a solution. So they coordinated, they were able to restore faith in the financial system, and the utter crisis was averted. And JP Morgan was hailed as the savior of his country, which almost exactly the same words that were used to thank Cosimo de' Medici when he came back to Florence in the 15th century. The problem, however, is that this was a democracy. So at the beginning of the 20th century, this behavior, this show of financial power, only fuels United States debate about the so-called money trust. So a group of super rich financiers, which supposedly was already controlling the finance and the economy of the United States, and that it was feared might have decided to try and control the politics of the country as well. And in fact, it is against the money trust that we have the establishment of the Federal Reserve System in 1912, to avoid the United States to ever again having to rely on the goodwill of a super rich individual. And it is also in this context that we have United States, the development of antitrust, anti-monopoly legislation. Now, the problem, and this is the final thing which I tell you, next slide. The problem is, did the rich play, and the super rich in particular, play the same role during the most recent crisis, be it the Great Recession beginning in 2008, the COVID-19 crisis which followed, current war in Ukraine, without forgetting in a country such as mine, which is Italy, the sovereign debt crisis in between? Did they? Well, you know, there is reason to doubt this. And one thing which is very clear, if you look at the wealth share of the richest after the Wall Street crisis of 1929, triggering the Great Depression, and after the financial crisis of 2007, triggering the Great Depression, you see that the dynamic is very different. And the point is, the wealth of the richest has become apparently much more resilient against crisis, which is good for them, of course, but it's kind of more troubling if you realize that this is also because in the 1930s, the resources collected to try and help the economy to recover were collected by means of growing and very progressive taxation. So the rich were made to pay part of the bill of the crisis. And this didn't happen today. It didn't happen in the 21st century. It didn't happen even when the part of the richest, especially in certain countries, those involved in finance, were accused of having sort of caused the Great Recession itself. So the point is, if the rich, next slide please, if the rich really have been given a specific role to play at the beginning, at the end of the Middle Ages, and they have played that role big time till at the very least the period of the world wars and the period in between the world wars, and today they aren't playing it anymore. And the question becomes whether the request that they play the role continues to exist across society in the context of Western culture, which I believe it does, but they're no longer playing it. And arguably, and I will stop here for the reasons of time, arguably this is something which can lead to societal concern about the rich themselves. I fear I told too much. I thank you for your attention. Next slide, and I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It was very interesting and very enlightening, and I've got many questions, but my questions have to wait because we have questions from the audience. So I will start with the first question. So the question is from Ian Farrell, who asks, in medieval England, governance was in the hands of the monarch and high nobility because they owned most of the land. In the 18th and 19th century, despite a widening franchise, the wealth still controlled parliament. Today, with universal franchise, the combined wealth of government ministers and MPs remains well above the national mean, and our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak at the moment, is one of the wealthiest citizens in the UK. Can you analyze why electors who are not wealthy vote for the very wealthy people to govern?
Well, this is one of the toughest questions to answer based on evidence, because the kind of evidence which you would really need to answer this is really not available. Now, let me tell you something more about this. A novelty of the end of the 20th century is that we start having super rich individuals who become very directly involved in politics, meaning they become prime ministers, beginning with Silvio Berlusconi in Italy in 1994. At a certain point in time, I think he was the 12th richest person in the world, okay? Now, a point I'm making in the book is, without judging this, okay? But the point I make is, I don't think that somebody like Berlusconi might have been elected in any Western countries to that kind of position in the 1960s, because the preferences of the voters in that moment were very much against the super rich and the very rich and the extremely rich becoming too much involved directly in politics. So this fear that the politics could take over wealth was enrooted in many countries, take the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. So the debate on the money trust wasn't a leftish thing. It was really shared across the board. It was a bipartisan concept back then. And this was still the case in the 1960s. So between the 1960s and the 1990s and then the 21st century, something changed in terms of the preferences of the voters. And this also connects to how we look at the rich. We today, across the West, tend to look at the rich much more as, models of behavior than in the past. This never was the case in the past. The rich were suspect, right? In the Middle Ages, it's clear, but also after, they were suspect. The super rich at the beginning of the 20th century were looked with some suspicion, because the idea was they are too powerful. We said, if they decide also to take control of politics, we will not be able to do anything to prevent that, okay? So how did this happen? So there is, I would argue, I argue in the book that there is this difference today. It's much more acceptable for a billionaire to become prime minister or president, take Silvio Berlusconi, Donald Trump, Rishi Sunak, than in previous epochs. How did this come to happen? I don't know, because unfortunately the period, again, between 1960s and 1990s hasn't been studied from this perspective. I would argue that this has to be also connected to the shift in preferences about taxation, which begins with the reforms by Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom. And this, they change the political platform of the center-right parties, while before everybody was in favor of progressive taxation. It was only a discussion about how to do it and to which extent. But this shift, which then of course also spreads to the center-left parties, is pretty important, because it leads the voters to become quite averse to taxation in general in the 21st century. So the question about why do the voters vote for somebody who can actually then control everything is also a question about why do the voters vote against basically having the richest contribute some more in times of crisis. I think that the answer to this question is, to these two questions, is pretty much the same. The suspicion is that the richest strata have some sort of a stronger control over politics, policy making, and also how political preferences develop compared to the past, but we don't have the smoking gun.
I wonder, you thinking about this, is it because we've changed from kind of this Christian theology to more the idea of meritocracy? And we've been fed this idea of trickle economics continuously to justify the position of the rich, and thus, come to the point of saying Rishi Sunak is the person to lead because he's made these millions, he has them, or Berlusconi, so he will know how to lead us and thus bring us to that kind of wealth aspect. Just another way saying that. I wonder, would you?
No, absolutely. Let's say that the ideology of meritocracy is clearly essential to the change in perception, in this case of the super rich, okay? Because I try to make a distinction between different levels of wealth. In the book, I talk about the rich, and in some cases about the super rich. And of course, the political concerns mostly have to do with the super rich when they decide to enter politics. The meritocracy surely played a key role in this change in perception. But even if you accept that as a value of today Western democracies, you can still make the argument that extreme wealth inequality isn't compatible with that kind of meritocracy. This is what Thomas Piketty says, right? If you have extreme wealth inequality, then how can really society be meritocratic? Because you're not playing everybody on the same playing field. And that's the problem. And in the 1960s, when we were really committed as societies to do that, the even playing field was built by collecting resources from the most affluent strata and by taxing inheritances, for example, right? So, the idea was to rebalance this in some way. And the ethical justification for doing that was to provide equal opportunities to everybody, because we wanted to reward merit already back then. So, meritocracy, which somebody criticized, whatever, but from my point of view, it is not the culprit in this change, right? It's, of course, is connected to how we see the rich, but again, if we really were committed to a meritocratic society, then arguably we should make more to create this even playing field. And we're going, in fact, in the opposite direction, right?
Yeah. So I have another, just to trend a little bit in a different direction. David Beavers asks, do you identify trends in the attempts by the wider body politics to harness these private bonds for public good? And if so, what approaches appear to have been most successful?
That's an excellent question. I would argue that, if you look at Western countries, many Western countries, if you look at them during the Great Recession, if you look at them during COVID-19, there have been repeatedly requests of having the most affluent to contribute more, right? But they didn't. And the reason why I say they didn't is that if you look at the recent surveys of fiscal reform in OECD countries, there are at least 2 or 3 different surveys, right? You will find there very little evidence of the super rich having been asked to contribute more during the crisis. So very little evidence of expansion of progressive taxation or of taxation of patrimonies and so forth and so on. And not even in a temporary manner. And this is interesting because the usual argument against this is capital flight. The idea is, okay, but now we live in a globalized world, and if you increase taxes, you will have the rich leaving. Even if you accept that, I don't really believe that if in the heat of the COVID-19 crisis, a prime minister had gone in front of his, citizens and told them, look, we are in a bad spot. This is going to cost us a huge amount of resources simply to contain the crisis and to manage it a bit. We are asking the most affluent members of society to contribute something more in only a temporary manner, and for doing this, right? I don't see capital flight happening in that case for 2 reasons. First, because I believe that most of the most affluent would have felt like ethically compelled to help. And secondly, because the social sanction against those who would have fled with their capital in that context would have been huge, right? So the point is, not even temporary measures which were proposed were introduced, with very limited examples to the contrary, like Spain did something to tax patrimonies in a progressive way. The Netherlands introduced some very small tweaks to different taxes to make them more progressive, but that's about it. So across the board, you have this request, which to me suggests that the role given by society in theory to the rich hasn't changed. So to help the others, especially in times of crisis, but they were able to avoid doing it. Why were they able to avoid doing that? Of course, we don't know, but the hypothesis is because they have much stronger control over policymaking than in previous epochs. And by previous epochs, I don't mean the 16th century. I mean the 1960s, 1970s. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Guido, very much. I mean, I think we have a problem of too short of a time and a lot of questions. And I apologize to the people that have put in questions, and we won't have time to address them. But what I want to say is many of the questions and interesting musings can be found in Guido's fantastic book, As Gods Among Men, which I enjoyed tremendously. And I'm sure Guido will be happy if you email him or have questions to hear your opinions and your questions to expand on this. This is kind of a rendition of history, but it is so relevant now with everything that we're questioning about this growing inequality while our economy is, we have economic growth, but yet growing inequality, and very relevant questions. But I'll have to stop here, unfortunately. I want to thank you, Guido, very, very much for this really first amazing book, an intriguing discussion, and a great, really very insightful presentation. And I want to thank everybody who's joined us today. Please remember that this recording of this event will be available on the Festivals of York Ideas YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival. You'll be contacted by email when the video is available to view. If you would like to purchase a copy of Guido's book, As Gods Among Men, it will be available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books, at foxlanebooks.co.uk. And this is all. Thank you very much. Have a pleasant afternoon.